As I am, after all, a material girl living in a material world, it is incumbent upon me to understand myself in material terms, in physical substances and interactions thereof. So let's talk about the biology, the chemistry, the classical and quantum physics, and the chaos mathematics that comprises me, you, and anyone who's ever lived ever. The idea being if we can actually understand on an intuitive level how these parts add up to the whole being that they do, we'd be better able to understand and look after ourselves and each other. So let's talk about it. Everything you've ever learned in school was almost certainly an attempt to explain the same thing to you. The same thing I am trying to explain right now in about 90 minutes, give or take. The grand totality of all of this human being and all the other human beings it exists in relation to. Over and over again, it's been taught to you with different languages, from different angles and dimensions and viewpoints, but ultimately, the same thing. Unfortunately, perhaps in the misguided interest of making things easier, this probably wasn't itself explained to you, at least not in this way. You were taught these subjects separately, likely without much, if any, articulation of how they relate to each other. And you were told you were learning them because it was important, or because you would need it for a job in the future, or because whatever, sit down and shut up. So even though you've most likely been told the same thing over and over again, in at least four languages, you probably still don't really get it. What is this? This body, this complex of parts, what is it composed of? How does it all work? Like, actually. For the longest time, my body felt like a black box to me, an unknowable mystery just spitting out random physical experiences and consequences that I couldn't even hope to begin to understand. The 3 years of courses across the expanses of biology, chemistry, and physics later, I have some answers and I want to share. It is a lot, so bear with me, but think how nice it'll be in the end when you feel like you actually really do get it. Anyway, I think the best way to explain everything is to start at the very innermost, smallest, and most fundamental part of us, the quantum layer, which is also the oldest part, and then work our way both forwards through time and outwards through the layers of the body until we arrive at the human being as we recognize it, doing behaviors. Well, this starting point, this quantum layer, is the realm of mathematics, the strange place. It's the bit without anything material, really, or recognizable that we can hang on to in trying to describe it. This is what we find when we grab a person and we pinch zoom and expand deeper and deeper and deeper into their biological tissue, within organs, then within cells, then within the components in cells, until all we see is just a chemical soup of molecules and ions swarming against each other. And then we zoom even further until the soup becomes a lattice mesh of interlacing atoms of different hues and vibrations. And then we zoom further still again to where there is only light and electricity in a particular pattern of occurrence. And then we zoom further again still to within these shells of electrical lightning to where it is mostly empty vacuum apart from motion at the center of this enclosure of empty vacuum. Waving undulations of the very fabric or ocean or substrate of this vacuum. My allegation is that this formless darkness, this substrate upon which the waveforms of everything that exists are expressed, that it is space-time, that it is gravity, that they are the same thing, that the substrate of space-time is the same as the material thing of gravity. Now, you don't necessarily have to agree with me, and indeed, when all this is said and done, you can fight me outside about it if you want. And actually, please do, because how else will I learn? But my rationale is simple. The distinctions that I see drawn between space-time and the phenomenon of that space-time bending and curving in relation to objects within it, they don't feel necessary. In any case, this is our starting point. It is the entire field in which all that happens happens. We don't know the origin of this most foundational layer. Maybe not yet, maybe never, maybe some know, but not I. If so, do tell. But what we do know is that there is a ground zero to this whole thing, a zeroth dimension. Partly because there literally has to be, and partly because when we look closer and closer with our most powerful microscopes and particle colliders, what we find inside the so called foundational particles is mostly vacuum and curvature, the vacuum of space, the absence of any charge, any mass, any anything, and yet somehow clearly a something in its own right. Whatever that nothingness is, it exists enough to play host to, or at least be shaped and interrupted by, the non vacuum, non nothing parts of protons and electrons and everything else that arises within it. And so, anyway, nothingness, formless deep, ocean of gravity, whatever works for you. I like ocean of gravity. And then, because in the beginning was the word, the first layer on top of this nothingness, the first step from that nothingness to this current layer of complexity that is a human being doing stuff in the here and now in relation to other objects, that first step is sound waves, which also means motion, pressure, frequencies that are not photonic or composed as light, propagating through that nothing everythingness, through that ocean of the substrate of gravity. And whether these waves and ripples were caused by the nothing everythingness, the ocean of gravity talking to itself, moving against itself, being hot for some reason, I am not sure. And for our purposes, it doesn't matter. We only know and need to know that at the foundation, before and at the very core of shapes, before and at the very core of light, etc., there is that thing, that ground zero, that space, that ocean, that void. And then within that void, there is motion. There are waves, frequencies rippling through. All right? Okay, let's move it along. Keeping in mind that our goal here is to understand this, the human body, intuitively, then I find this to be a wonderfully sufficient foundation to start with. And to get from that foundation to where things start sounding a little more familiar, like atoms and molecules, we need to tell ourselves a story. Taking the very best of what quantum mechanics and metaphysical philosophy have afforded us, any logical narrative we can form hence will do. Remember, our goal here is to reach an understanding. If we have to bridge a fuzzy, mysterious area with scaffolding made from logically consistent conjecture, then so be it. So, anyway, as we just agreed, the zeroth or base layer of a field of the zeroth or base layer is a field of gravity. Before all the complexity that developed with time, there is gravity, an everywhere and everywhen field, or ocean. I like ocean of gravity. Then the next order of complexity to get to on the journey all the way out here from the ocean of gravity is shapes. And the key to shapes are boundaries, or perimeters, or membranes. Anything that persistently encloses a given area of an overall field will give rise to a shape, like, say, an enclosure holding in a given area of the overall field or ocean of gravity. That would be a shape. That would be something material we could build on to get to atoms and elements. And we get these shapes as a consequence of all that motion in the ocean, ripples, waves, pressure moving through this ocean of gravity. It is recorded in nearly all our primordial origin myths. Whether we say, in the beginning was the word, was sound, was music, or whether we say, in the beginning was a big bang that exploded out everywhere throughout space time as heat and pressure. We keep saying it. And besides, the other way we know that waves of motion is how we get to shapes is that we know that all the energy that's moving through the universe's background light now would be sound waves if you slow them down. And we worked out the math on how it would affect the rest of the universe, the matter, etc., if background light was background sound waves. And the answer described a universe of shapes that matched what the philosophers and cosmologists had theorized that a baby universe would have to look like in order to have all the necessary pieces and trajectory to turn into the universe we experience and take in with our senses now. Do you get what I mean? The math says that if what is now background light was background sound, this is what the matter of the universe would look like. And that mathematically endorsed composition corresponds to what we've sketched out from our cosmological theories of what the matter of the universe must have looked like at a time before the level of complexity that we now see in the light of our day. Whenever we have a situation where what the maths predicts is the same as what is posited by separately, painstakingly, logically conjectured theory from myriad observations, we tend to consider that almost certainly a yes. Anyway, yes, for whatever reason, waves, motion, pressure rippling through this ocean of gravity. And these ripples and waves, they interact, they're colliding, combining into all sorts of patterns of motion within the field until some form of standing waves occur, a particular shape or waveform of intersecting waves that keeps persisting because it keeps being fed by the waves that crash against each other to form it. Persisting, continuing, and continuous standing waves. These are the proto shapes within this ocean that will afford us our initial building blocks, or building spheres, little pockets of motion, membraned or enclosed by an area of collision between the force of their own motion and the surrounding rest of the ocean of gravity moving around them. So, look, I know from experience that this one is a little sticky to get your head around. You're trying to think of the formation of a shape in the ocean resulting from a given pattern of waves, membraned or enclosed by the contrasting motion surrounding that pattern of waves. But once you're through this, it's just shapes gumming onto each other until a megazord of shapes emerges. Comparatively, very easy, very fun. So just breathe through this last bit of weirdness with me. But anyway, to reiterate it a different way so that we can reinforce the learning. To get from ocean of gravity to shapes within said ocean of gravity via motion, let's think about two things in succession. The first is the idea of standing waves and their perimeters, where the pattern of the standing wave is pushing up against the currents of the remaining moving ocean of gravity beyond the standing wave. So the ocean of gravity is in two shapes of motion pushing against itself. Gravity, in the form of the standing wave, is pushing against gravity in the form of the rest of the current in the surrounding ocean. And then next, let's go a little deeper on that thought and let's think about the idea of this collision at that perimeter where it's happening, at the line that is the limit of the standing wave and the line where the rest of the moving current of gravity resumes. This collision of the same thing in two forms, gravity against gravity, it's resulting in all this generated force that flows, that explodes away from where it happens from the perimeter and goes to the only other places remaining if you're exploding away from the perimeter, away beyond the perimeter into the remaining current of the rest of the ocean of gravity, and away inwards into the core of the standing waves. Do you see how that starts to create an outline? The gravity that exists between the colliding gravities of the standing wave motion and the moving current of the rest of the wider environment, that sliver of space has to, by definition, be pretty cold and empty because it is continuously being emptied of all its heat and motion, as the force of the collision taking place within it drives heat and motion away from the perimeter and into the centers of the standing wave and out into the remaining ocean of the current beyond the standing wave. And so this perimeter keeps approaching the absolute zero of an empty vacuum on account of the heat being emptied out, but never actually reaches absolute zero because the very same standing wave core and surrounding slash otherwise flowing ocean of gravity that are emptying out the heat also keep colliding to create that heat in the first place in that perimeter space. And so we have at the perimeter a continuously cooling space, and the upshot of all of this is ice, in a certain sense. Because that's what happens in our universe when things approach 0 degrees of motion. They crystallize into solidity. And we know, as you'll see as we go on, that in our universe, it's all repeating patterns. If a thing is fundamentally true, it generally keeps being true. The way it works is the way it works at the different levels of complexity. And it's also important to remember that we literally know that mass and materiality and solidity are a thing from subatomic particles onwards. So, what we're trying to do here is put in place a logically consistent explanation for how you get from the context of waves in a substrate to material or mass carrying solids, plus waves in a substrate. So, anyway, yes, the combination of all that collision and heat expulsion and cooling at that perimeter is a contextual situation where ice can form, a contextual situation that maps on to what the quantum physicists call the Higgs field. wherein some accretion of remainder gravity and motion is frozen slow enough to be described as ice, as mass having ice, solidity, materiality. And also, beyond this perimeter ice shell, we should note that the energy that is pulled away from the perimeter and into the core of the standing wave, it serves to press more and more motion into that core, into that center, creating a dense convergence of vibration that the scientists call gluons, or the gluonic force. And the energy that is pulled away from the perimeter and back out into the rest of the moving ocean of gravity beyond the standing wave, that is a precursor to light, an emission before we heat the let there be light point of our journey. And so therefore, it only has enough force to be described as thermal, as heat, as so-called black body radiation. So it's one level of complexity up from sound waves, for instance, but it's not quite at frequencies that we can call photons or light just yet. And so, yeah, these perimeter collisions between gravity in the form of standing waves, gravity in the form of the rest of the moving ocean of gravity, they create yet more motion or heat that they drive into the core of the standing waves as gluons and out away from the standing wave into the surrounding ocean of gravity as black body radiation. The perimeter limit itself then is left colder and colder, and once it is cold enough, we see another form of gravity emerge, a third one. Gravity in the context of a particular temperature, a Higgs field, cold enough to freeze the substrate of ours into mass having, mass being ice. So we can get to shapes from the ocean of gravitational nothingness via frozen records of standing waves, wiggling with gluonic force and emitting black body radiation, ice-shelled encasements of rippling gravity, like bubbles in an ocean, or marbles, bubbles. These spheres are made of gravity, and at the same time, they're also distinct from the rest of the ocean of moving gravity by virtue of the enclosing Higgs ice shell plus the black body radiation membrane of the bubble, which itself results from gravity in one form pushing against gravity in another form deep within this ice shell at the true perimeter of the standing wave. These ice spheres or bubbles or marbles, these shapes of gravity and motion amidst the overall ocean of moving gravity, these are called quarks. And this is how we move from the realm of chaos mathematics and motion and frequencies into dimensional geometry and physics, into shapes and frequencies of motion between shapes that we can actually verify in real life by generating them in large particle colliders. So, not quite the familiar territory of atoms that we will soon reach, but certainly safe ground, because three of these bubbles combining together is a baryon, a proton or a neutron, which you've certainly heard of. And yes, before you ask, specifically three bubbles for our purposes. Two bubbles can collide and combine together, but not much happens for long, because two cannot match the stability or persistence of the force resulting from a triple combo. So when three bubble collisions happen, their triplicate standing waves combine forces against the rest of moving gravity at their combined perimeters. So we get a triple force repetition of the same thing as before. Picture it. Three ice-shelled waveforms clustered together in a tri-spherical Mickey Mouse head formation. The combination of their combined waveforms and black body radiation and ice shells pulsing out to collide against the rest of the flowing gravity beyond. And just as before with quark formations, where it was one standing wave against the current of the wider ocean of gravity, with this collision of a triple standing wave plus the black body radiations and the Higgs ice shell masses against that same wider current in the ocean of gravity, all the heat from the collisions of these two things is once again being driven away from the perimeter where the collision is taking place, away from the perimeter of the Mickey Mouse head triple sphere. Once again, it is driven away both inwards into the triple core of dense vibration at the center of this compound object, and away outwards as a collectively surrounding tri-spherical Mickey Mouse head halo of electrical radiation. And in between this inward flowing nuclear force and outward flowing radiation, we have that Higgs context again, or something like it, and therefore the cold material ice or solid mass of the perimeter membrane develops. And thus we have baryons, protons or neutrons, three quark standing waves instead of one, and electrical radiation or charge diffusion instead of black body radiation as before with the single waveform of a single quark. Fun fact. Single quarks are only a conceptual notion. Apparently, in our universe, you don't ever really see solitary quarks on their lonesome. And when you try to pull apart two quarks, like in a hadron collider, for instance, the force you apply to try to pull them apart will generate another quark from the surrounding ocean of gravity inside that physics lab. Anyway, there is another thing to highlight here in order to really understand our ocean of gravity at this third level of entropic complexity and to really understand electrical charge. And that thing is what happens when quark bubbles or marbles, some people imagine it better with marbles, but what happens when they come together, but they don't combine into baryons and they instead fly apart or annihilate each other? So the force that is expelled from these quark collisions is also electrical. Another way to think about that is to imagine this sliver of space that is pressed between the ice shells of each bubble that is colliding, pressed such that the radiation layer on top of the ice shell, the outward flowing force that would have been the surrounding black body radiation in a regular singleton bubble, it's now pressing against itself, radiation on radiation, multiplying the force so that it has a different nature until it is so strong, it is strong enough to push apart, even annihilate the bubbles, and then radiate outwards as electricity or as leptons, which is what the quantum physicists call this category of energy behavior. Most popularly, the electron. We will come back to the electron shortly. This specific form of motion in the ocean of gravity, electrical force, is going to be very important for our purposes of materially explaining the human being in full. Okay, so we're up to the third level of entropic we're up to the third level of entropy or complexity. We're up to team baryons. Well, technically team hadrons, but we don't care about double quark bubbles or quadruple quark bubbles. We only care about the subsection of the hadron category containing triple quark bubbles, and we call these baryons. And so anyway, yes, on the one hand, we have baryons, protons and neutrons, bubbles whose colliding forces hold them together into Mickey Mouse head trispherical shapes. And then on the other, we have any number of quark bubbles colliding, their ice shells smashing and combining with their pressed together black body radiations to turn into lepton forces like electrons and neutrinos and muons. And these are either force fields of potential action or moments in spacetime of actual particular collision that we call particles. Ergo, an electrical force field or an electron particle. And this is a type of force we like so much that, for better or worse, we named it electricity and we have domesticated it to serve us in every way. Yay. So with our baryons, the protons and neutrons, and our electron-grade bubble smash-apart force, electricity now in hand, let's forge onwards and outwards to the fourth level of entropy, the realm of atoms and light. To get from fermions, the category name for baryons and electrons, to atoms and light, we need to witness how protons do their thing. Again, protons are those trispherical Mickey Mouse head conjoined quark bubbles, and each quark is made of a continuously fed standing wave of the ocean of gravity encased in Higgs ice and radiating black body radiation. And protons, I should also note, are the more agile kind of trispherical quark compound, full of more wiggle than their neutral neutrons, because their formative quarks have more uppers than downers waveform-wise. Anyway, yes. To imagine the birth of an atom, you need to witness in your mind's eye a bunch of protons colliding and tangling up their combined radiation layers into a mesh, into a weave of electrons, a core of multiple baryons surrounded by a cloud of electricity. Sometimes the electrical force of the cloud perfectly matches the motion force of the protons, and you have neutral balanced atoms, stable. And sometimes there's more or less electrical force in the cloud than there is in the proton motion at the core, and you end up with electrically charged atoms, negatively or positively charged ions, as they're called, where there is spare charge to radiate out into the surrounding environment, or a space and a hunger to take in electrical charge from the environment, respectively. And whether neutral or charged, it is this combo, this shape, this mesh of electrical potential holding the mass-carrying spheres made of intrinsically wiggling bubbles It's this that forms our true, or at least more familiar building blocks, atomic elements. Your hydrogens and heliums and lithiums, and eventually your carbons and oxygens and what have you. And because I know some of you are like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Let's go over it again. Remember how the opposite of baryons being those triple quark bubbles who hold together gluonically and Higgs isishly and emit a collective aura of electrical radiation? Remember how the opposite of those are the bubbles that don't hold together after collision, but they end up pressing their black body radiations into an electrical force that pushes apart or annihilates them. Well, from that, we can appreciate how black body radiation pressed up against more black body radiation can be multiplied into stronger versions of force, or to use the physics lingo, can be increased in wave frequency. Black body radiation pressed up against black body radiation as a result of multiple quarks and hadrons pressing up against themselves can become many things. Chiefly for our purposes are three forms: electrical force, atomic electron shells, or meshes of multiple atomic electron shells, and light. So one, an electrically repulsive force that pushes apart or annihilates the quark bubbles and their Higgs ice shells and then permeates through the surrounding ocean of gravity in motion as mass carrying or shards of Higgs ice carrying electron particles and electron force fields. That's the first. Two, a binding force that weaves in and around the Higgs ice to form the electron shells that encase the protons and neutrons, pressing them together at their core, at their nucleon, to make up an atom. Yay. And then finally, thirdly, black body radiation pressed up against black body radiation can multiply frequency until the radiation is now of a wavelength so short we would call it light. That's why you can squeeze light out of the electron shells surrounding atoms, for instance, or that's why you can see light released when electrical force pushes apart or annihilates quark bubbles and their Higgs ice shells. Light is essentially electrical force minus mass, or Higgs ice. Like if you go up in wavelength frequency from black body radiation, you'll get to visible light. And then if you add Higgs ice and mass to that level of frequency and situation, you'll get electrical charge. Obviously, also, photonic radiation is not only visible light, but it is also heat, depending on the wavelength. And so, indeed, some people, reasonably enough, do away with the distinction between black body photonic radiation and visible light photonic radiation. And they just call them all photonic excitations of the electromagnetic field. But yeah, even though it is all the one thing, it's all the one spectrum of field excitations, and you could cut it different ways. You could, call it just one general category of energy as distinct from the true matter of solid baryons, or you could split it into two and have one category of photons, both visible and invisible, and then another category of mass carrying electrons, etc. I like three because there's just something intuitive about level one radiation or excitation of the electromagnetic field being non-light thermal radiation, level 2 being light or photons, and level 3 being the mass carrying force of electrons. But anyway, finally, light is the same kind of motion as electrical charge, just without the mass that electrons carry. And if you could hypothetically peel away the mass being carried from an electron type of motion, the leftover behavior would simply be a photon. Pure motion without the weight. And then black body radiation is that same photonic motion and an even more languid, low frequency register that feels like heat instead of looking like light. It's all the same fundamental shape of occurrence expressed at different frequencies and with different amounts of carried mass. So, all right, now that we've reached the level of atomic elements and light, the collisions that now matter, are not the ones happening at the ice membranes of quark bubbles, nor the ones happening when three bubbles come together to hold each other in the triple sphere Mickey Mouse shape of a proton or a neutron, or conversely press their black body radiations together until it multiplies into an explosive mass carrying force that we know and love as electricity. Those collisions are still happening. They're all still going on deep within the atomic structure. They continue, but they only give rise to more and various and continuously transforming atomic elemental meshes. Higgs ice shelled baryon nucleons surrounded and interwoven with the lightning strike of electrical radiation plus Higgs ice that is the electron. And also, when I say mesh, think like woven fabric of light in a repeating tile pattern, for instance. So, anyway, yes, in this fourth level of entropy, in this atomic element plus light dimension, the collisions that matter are between those different meshes of ice, motion, and lightning. And as before, some collisions result in a holding together, a new combination of intrinsic gravitational motion and Higgs ice masses and electrical force, a new shape of activity in the ocean of gravity we are still ultimately within. And then, on the other hand, some other collisions result in a pulling apart of elemental meshes or the subatomic components within, and the release of explosive force thereafter. And also, all the time, there is still black body radiation from those ice shells of those quarks deep within those atomic meshes being squeezed all the way up and out as light. And so as light moves around these meshes of atomic elements and electricity or electrical force moves between them and gravitational motion yet oscillates within their quarks, we get the stage set for the more dramatic scenes of clumping together and blowing apart that brings us up from the domain of classical physics to that of chemistry. Atomic elemental meshes clump together into molecules and compounds, your gas clouds and your liquid rivers and your compressed solids of hydrogens and oxygens and carbons and benzenes and what have you, still in motion as they were at the beginning, and now even still are at their core as waves in the ocean of gravity. So, shapes then. We have our shapes. We've gone from an ocean of gravity to motion in the ocean, resulting in standing waves, to multiple standing waves pushing against each other until their force concentrates at the center and their perimeters freeze so that we have ice-shelled bubbles of moving gravity. And then those ice-shelled quark bubbles come together in a way we'd call magnetic if we were dealing with macro objects, but we call gluonic at this quantum scale. And their collisions either give us hadrons in general and baryons in particular, those triple Mickey Mouse head ice-shelled bubbles, or they give us the explosive force of an electron made from the combination of the blackbody radiations that were dissipating off the ice shells and shards of that exploded ice. And then to hadrons colliding to either combine into a nucleon of protons and neutrons surrounded by electrons made of their combined blackbody radiation and some ice, an atom, or we get hadrons colliding into explosions that release electrons and light, etc. So shapes then, shapes on shapes. Moving, pressing, combining, swirling as gas, holding in interlocking chains as moisture, clumping together into cooled solid matter, combining until we get to planets and stars, those giant clumps of meshes of gravitational motion, ice, electrical force, and leaking light. And we get to planets and stars from multi-atomic meshes because as these meshes compound and press on each other, another emergent pattern shows up, one that litters the timeline with recurrence, like it shows up a lot. Grouping. At a certain scale of atomic meshes meshing together into different swarms of matter and energy, we see that gravity pulls strongest between waveforms most like each other. Like gravitates towards like until the densest aspects of this super mesh of bonded atoms are pressed together at the core, at what becomes the core, surrounded then by the remaining materials in descending order of mass. So we end up with solid, densely pressurized cores, vibrating and sending those waves through a less dense, like plasmic middle, and then dissipating out into the environment as electric and photonic radiation. And just as in every other perimeter and environment clash we've seen so far, and we will always see, this emptying and cooling at the boundary creates a frozen solid crust. Unless you're a sun, in which case you radiate far too exuberantly for anything resembling a crust to survive. But anyway, that brings us up from whenever, wherever this rippling and standing waves business started. And by the way, our best math, backed by empirical data we have, says at least 13.7 billion years ago, everywhere. But in any case, yes, that brings us from then until about 1 billion years ago, where one of these clumps of rock, that is the aggregate of all the gases and liquids and ice solids in the vicinity, is our planet Earth. spinning around another aggregation that is the sun, and with a bunch of other stellar bodies around. And because of how many layers of entropy we're talking about now, gravity, which was once singular, is now distributed in such interesting ways. The oneness of the starting ocean of gravity that then became a two-ness in the form of a stillness in some parts and movement in other parts, and then became a threeness in the form of stillness in some parts, movement in general in some other parts, and then movement in the specific form of standing waves in a third part, and then became a fourness in terms of stillness in some parts, movement in general in some parts, movement in the specific form of standing waves in another part, and the emergent consequence of ice-shelled encasements of some standing waves into bubbles or marbles in a fourth part, and eventually becomes a nineness that includes stillness in some parts, movement in general in other parts, movement in the specific form of standing waves in other parts, the emergent consequence of ice-shelled encasements of some standing waves into bubbles in yet other parts. Fifthly, then, the expression of the standing waves beyond the ice shells and out of those bubbles as blackbody radiation. Sixthly, then, the collision of multiple quarks and the combination of blackbody radiations into the gluonic force that can hold quarks together as hadrons, and in particular baryonic hadrons like protons and neutrons. Seventhly, the collisions and combinations of baryons into nucleon clusters and the multiplication of their blackbody radiations and the ice shells into electrical explosive mass carrying force that pulls these nucleons apart, or into binding shell meshes that holds the nucleons together into atoms and elements and matter. And eighthly, the emission of what would be blackbody radiation through the layers of electron mesh such that it is instead released as light. And ninthly, the aggregation of meshes of atomic elements in such a way that things most like each other are nearest, such that the ice is pressed together, and the electron mesh forms a surrounding outer shell. Yay for cosmic spheres, and yay for the ninth level of entropic complexity. Anyway, largely speaking, it's from this electron shell on the outside that we get the qualities of the materials of the objects in the universe we can see around us with human eyes, etc. Because the ice bits merged together make up most of the mass, the solidity, the weight of the object. But it is the electron shell and its electric mediation between the interior of the object and the exterior of the wider environment. It's this that gives rise to the qualities like color and temperature. Well, technically, I guess you also have to give credit to the layer of mass, the crust of the perimeter, cooled and laying just inside the electric field between the force rushing inwards to meet the core of the object and that which is rushing outwards to dissipate into the surrounding environment. Because it is this solidity that becomes imprinted with the electrochemical consequences of the exchange of forces between object and surrounding environment. It is this solid crust that bears the color or moves in the thermal signature of the electric field, of the electron shell of the object, such that we humans and our instruments can experience them. But then you have to give everything credit at that rate, because after all, everything, all these material qualities are actually the result of interplay between aggregated nucleonic core vibrations and the surrounding combined electrophotonic magnetic gravitational forces out there, just as it was between the standing waves and the rest of the ocean of gravity. So the color, the temperature, and other characteristics of objects is really down to that original motion in those original standing waves inside that ice-shelled quark bubble, escalated 9 levels up by all the other layers of force from blackbody radiation to gluonic to electrical until we're all the way out here bearing witness to whatever the wavelength of electrical charge or kinetic action we're seeing moving in our macro reality. But anyway, through all this, we can appreciate that shapes now are any stable compromise between the standing waves of those same quarks within the protons and neutrons and the activity of the surrounding total environmental force field out there. Another cool way to think about objects in our universe is that the clumped together ice bits are the stillest parts, and the electrical charge and emitted light, etc., are the most moving parts of the same whole. If the still parts slow down and the motion near them, you'd observe less energy and more mass from the object. And if the moving parts speed up the stillness near them, there'd be less mass and more energy. E equals mc squared after all. And so, yes, what was once just ripples in the field have now given rise to quite a lot of motion and emergent consequences. Yet, all these material and energetic consequences of that original motion are still, on some level, and always will be at the core of every material thing, just ripples in the field of gravity. And so now we have our physical objects and forces assembled, thanks to an ocean of gravity moving in 9 different ways. We can go up a level and call it a 10th style of motion or call it a squaring of the 9 before this. Either way, the collisions that are interesting to us at this cosmic scale are not between subatomic particles to form atoms or between atomic elemental meshes to form bodies. It's now between all these bodies and objects moving through the ocean of gravity, of space time. Now, here I think is finally safe ground because, after all, while most of us rarely, if ever, directly witness the formation or annihilation of matter or objects, we do regularly witness the interactions and exchanges of light and electrical force between these various objects formed of gravitationally grouped aggregations of meshes of atomic elements, all those planets and stars and asteroids and what have you. We look up or down or around and we see shapes combining, colliding, exploding, imploding, melting, freezing, lightning, darkening, all sorts of happenings. For instance, during the daytime, we can look up and see one especially large spherical clump of protons and electrons pressing against themselves and the surrounding electrogravitational field with such intensity as to be spewing electrical force and photons out in every direction. Huzzah for a light emitting sun and its white body radiation. And then under our feet, another clump is molecularly, elementally, materially, and gravitationally distributed as to result in a hot, sun like dense vibrating core, then a less dense plasmic magma layer, and then a least dense electrically charged layer of cooled perimeter crust of Earth, water, and atmospheric gases. Home. This particular distribution of material shapes is because of, and continues to give rise to, the sort of context that is coincidentally very good for the proliferation of carbon. Carbon is a particular type of atomic elemental mesh with its six-fold proton and neutron nucleus and its proportional six-fold standing wave of quark-held gravity and motion expressed out as electromagnetic force. It just has staying power. Solid, active enough to react and combine with things, but like stable, almost inert compared to some others. An ideal building block, really, at least at this contextual temperature or motion of the grand total of rippling through the fabric of space time or gravity. If there was more waving and more shapes in motion, carbon might get pulled apart or fused with other things in a more volatile pattern of physiochemical activity. But at this level of ambient activity, carbon's special skill of being solid at all temperatures in the range means we're talking building block extraordinaire. And of course, carbon is not alone. There are other meshes with a different compositional tile pattern that equally function as semi inert containers and structure our world, like silicon, for instance. But let's just use carbon as a stand in for all such things, much the same way as we earlier used light as a stand in for all wavelengths of radiation between black body and mass carrying electrical charge. We like convenience around here. And so, anyway, yeah, Earth is not only the result of an abundance of carbon, it is also the result of all the ways in which that carbon moves and interacts with and is transformed as a result of the other frequencies of the ocean of gravity and motion against itself at this level of complexity. So we have carbon as it's affected by oxygen, another type of elemental mesh with a different internal structure of baryons and electrons. We have carbon as it's affected by hydrogen, as it's affected by nitrogen, etc. Carbon as it's pushed and pulled into different colors, configurations, textures, groupings, and acidities. It is these interactions that result in configurations of atomic elemental meshes into compound shapes of all sorts, shapes like the spherical body of the planet itself, as well as everything we find on top of it. Molecular compounds, chalks, crystals, strings, liquids, oils, plasmas, gas clouds. Because as matter, aka configurations of gravity, are wont to do in our universe that is itself an ocean of gravity, like clumps together with like, or with equivalents at least. And recall how we get to spherical bodies as a result of the Higgs ice gathering together, leaving most of the electrical field to surround as a shell. Well, anyway, it's thanks to this repeating pattern that we end up with, broadly speaking, chalks and crystals clumped together, waters gliding over each other, strings tangled up together in fabrics, and atmospheric gases flowing through all. Order from preferential grouping, all because motion in the ocean of gravity affects other motion in the ocean of gravity, and similar waveforms can entangle and cohere into a whole that is the sum of all its parts and more, or cancel each other out as the case may be. But yes, motion, rhythm, frequency in our universe will gravitate towards its like and seek to combine into more or less or nothing. And not long from now, when we're all the way up to people, this will be what is to blame for literally all human phenomenology. But anyway, for now, circa 4.5 billion years ago, we are still allowing earthen geology to play out, watching motion in the ocean of gravity, now compounded 11 times over, and manifesting as interplay between acids and bases. We have toggled to a different dimensional view of spacetime in this neighborhood. We have left behind the view of previous configurations of elemental meshes of atoms formed of electron-shelled baryons wiggling on account of containing some number of trispherical Mickey Mouse head-shaped quarks, which themselves move only because they are technically mere waveforms in the ocean of gravity that have collided and compounded on themselves enough to create at their combined perimeter a Higgs field, a context cold enough for the substrate of the ocean of gravity within the context to freeze and give us ice shells to encase the standing waveforms of the ocean of gravity into bubbles or marbles that will be the first solids from which the whole category of matter will develop. We have left all this behind to zoom out and watch the atomic elemental meshes on the crust of the planet Earth. And we are especially watching for the ways in which they exchange motion, because that is all chemistry is, exchanges of energy between atomic elemental meshes or between the molecules and other objects that they compound into. Basically, when two meshes meet, they can exchange motion or energy in different quantities, different quanta. And the scale of the exchange determines what kind of phenomenon we witness. At level 1, meshes are exchanging kinetic energy. A mesh can bump into another mesh, can radiate heat or pressure at it, passing some amount of only the tiniest quantum or the longest wavelengths of energy to this other mesh. So we're not talking frequencies that would mean giving away electrical charge or giving away gravitational motion. We're just talking a nudge of kinetic energy. These are the exchanges that show up as temperature changes or pressure changes or the acceleration of particles. You know, it's take in more mesh or take in more energy and mesh move more. Give out some energy, mesh move less. Enough of these nudges in or out of the mesh, and the whole collective of atoms will loosen or tighten its interconnections and will change how much the particles within it move relative to each other. So gases slow into liquids, liquids settle into solids, or solids melt back down again, etc. That's phase shifting. But if these meshes exchange motion at the next quantum up, if one mesh radiates electrical force at another, gives away in part or in full an electron's worth of energy, then we are talking territory of charge and bonding and molecular identity. And this is where meshes share or exchange or steal electrons and become entirely different meshes as a result. So not just the same mesh in a liquid phase versus a solid phase, etc., but a different mesh altogether. Because now the electron weave that is holding the baryons together in the particular tau pattern that is repeated in this mesh, it's different. It is stronger or weaker and therefore holding the baryons together differently, or holding a different number of baryons together, or just radiating more or less electrical force from its perimeter. And all of this reshapes the fundamental geometry of the mesh, alters what other meshes it can cling to or fall apart from, how strongly it can form bonds with other meshes, etc. And these exchanges of electrical energy determine whether atomic meshes compound into 3D molecular objects, and then whether those molecules ultimately, hold together or break apart. And even besides bonding, electrical force exchanges and the resulting electrical nature of the meshes afterwards will determine how a given atomic mesh tends to behave, whether it tends to by default hold together solidly, fluidly, or as a volatile gas. And so, a good example of this, of electron level exchange, is salt dissolving in water. The compound object of salt, which is basically layers and layers and layers upon each other of sodium chlorine meshes held together by electrical force into a stable 3D lattice structure. This encounters the even stronger polar electrical field of water. The water mesh offers a more attractive electrical environment and pulls electrical force out of the salt compound, weakening the bonds between the sodium and chlorine meshes. The lattice falls apart, and the salt disintegrates from a cohered crystal into free floating charged meshes of sodium and chlorine, floating independently through the larger mesh of water. And then there is the third level, where the quantum of motion exchange is a proton's worth, or hydrogen ions worth, when a mesh gives another some amount of energy in the frequency or wavelength that corresponds to one of its protons. Both meshes are transformed on a subatomic level, because a proton or hydrogen ion's worth of energy is the intrinsic standing wave motion of the quarks inside them. So donating or absorbing one affects the baryon cluster at the core of the atom and forces an even deeper reconfiguration of the whole mesh. A proton transfer changes fundamentally how much quark energy there is around in the first place, which changes the mass and how much original blackbody radiation there is to be multiplied into the electrical force that makes up the electron shell weave of the whole mesh. It affects every level of the mesh structure. These exchanges are what we call acids and bases. A mesh that gives up a hydrogen ion is an acid, and it's said to have a high proportion of hydrogen ions, enough to give away, or a high pH. A mesh that takes one in is a base, or has a low pH and room for more. And this is why the hydrochloric acid in your stomach can break down food so dramatically, because the hydrogen chlorine mesh has so much extra spare or extra proton motion to give away that anything it touches becomes overloaded with this additional standing wave motion that it's donating, this additional wave motion and Higgs ice mass and electrical charge, etc. And the internal bonds of the receiving mesh are shaken apart or pulled into geometries they cannot hold as a result of taking all this on. So in your stomach, spare hydrogen ions slip from the pH heavy hydrochloric acid mesh into the carbon and hydrogen carbohydrate mesh, and all that new motion destabilizes the electron bonds between the carbons and hydrogens and forces the whole structure to collapse into simpler fragments. Freed hydrogens then latch onto oxygen, for instance, and become water, H2O, a mesh so stable it pretty much just sits out the rest of chemistry. Proton level exchanges don't just loosen bonds, they shove meshes into configurations that can't persist, they force collapse and recombination into whatever simpler, more stable shapes the universe will allow. Now, the sharp eared among you might quibble, hang on. If proton exchange is supposed to be atomic level transformation, why does hydrochloric acid just seem to break apart molecules the same way electron energy exchanges do? Fair. But that is because biology takes place at the molecular level. Even when something shifts at the atomic or the quantum scale, we only ever witness its consequences as molecular behavior. One molecular object gives away a bunch of electrical force, maybe even an electron's worth of energy, and it disintegrates into simpler meshes. Another takes in a spare hydrogen ion from a nearby acid and gains so much additional subatomic motion that its electron shell cannot hold its arrangement, and it too fragments. To our eyes, both outcomes look similar, it's just molecules disintegrating, but their initiating causes and the way the disintegration technically plays out, they're not the same. In environments where we can see atomic behavior in stars, in high energy plasmas, in nuclear reactors, for instance, It's very clear proton exchanges do not just distort molecules. We can see that they destabilize atoms, they reweight baryonic cores, and they bring entirely new elements or isotopes into being, or they release enough atomic energy to wipe out an entire city. In living organisms, everything is so macro. Our tiniest objects are still compounds of billions of atomic elemental meshes. So these kinds of effects just don't play out in biology. And both proton chemistry and electron chemistry kind of blur into the same category of visible effect for us here, just molecules falling apart or transforming. So, yes, interconnected atomic meshes flowing together in collectives of various degrees of motion, sometimes exchanging low frequency kinetic energy that just shift their phases, sometimes exchanging electrical force that shift their molecular structure and compound them into 3D objects, and sometimes they're exchanging whole proton waveforms that reshape them completely from the inside out. Thus, we have a planet Earth that is itself lots of atomic elemental meshes combined together and exchanging forces in a way that ultimately adds up to the grouping effect of like with like that makes what should be separate meshes into a whole new object, a spherical body. And on that planet Earth, we have a bunch more atomic elemental meshes interacting, changing phase and structure, compounding into molecular 3D objects, etc., culminating in chalks and crystals clumped together, waters gliding over one another, strings tangled into fibers, gases drifting through it all. Indeed, we come to have so many meshes, it all pretty much agglomerates into one giant mesh of countless interrelations between electrical charge, mass, and light. And if you're like, why so much mesh? Why so many atoms in one place? You'll recall that all this hoo ha began with motion, and motion begets more motion. It pulls other waveforms into being. It multiplies itself, etc. So, where there is more entropy, more consequence of motion that is itself yet moving, it will beget more motion and thus more consequence of motion that is itself moving, etc. And because this is foundational and a pattern that's true of the very first layer of all that we're dealing with here, it repeats itself over and over again through all the subsequent orders of complexity. This thing of motion begetting motion, or motion having some sort of consequence on the surrounding environment of the ocean of gravity, a consequence that can really only be expressed as more motion of some proportional amount, or the inverse, more stillness of some proportional amount. This is why everything on the level of atomic meshes is sparking off against each other, fusing, repelling, releasing charge. And this is why everything on the level of material forms and spherical bodies and suns and just matter in general is constantly pulling on each other, entangling everything around in the wavelength of the waveform that is still yet encased within all that ice and radiating out as electrical potential, exerting gravity on each other, exerting magnetic force on each other, and moreover, fusing, repelling, releasing charge into each other. It is this same gravitational entanglement, the same consequence of being mere motion in the ocean of the same stuff, that we call the electromagnetic force, a term that roughly captures this tendency of all matter to push charge and pull proximity, pull relational hold on all other matter. And so now here is something key, here's something very key to appreciate. And that is, we do not merely gravitationally hold each other in place with our motion, we also create each other. All matter, with our various waveforms motioning the ocean around, we create the entropy that comes to comprise each other. With our motion, we push into being the waveforms of quarks and the Higgs contacts to seal those waveforms into ice shells, and thus add more fermion particles to electromagnetically interact and ultimately assemble into more atomic elemental meshes that will be more gases or liquids or solids in the environment to make us up. This is what everyone's been trying to get across to you and saying there is no creation or destruction of energy in the universe, and that everything is actually all connected and it's all just continuous emergence and transformation of the same thing. It's all the same substrate of the ocean of gravity, of space time, whatever that is, being stirred into motion by all sorts of omnidirectional consequences. We don't, for the sake of understanding the human body, need to know the what or how of the substrate of the ocean of gravity. And we don't need to know the what or how of the first wave of motion to stir it. It's an incomplete but perfectly solid foundation to simply grasp that once we have any motion in this ocean of gravity, all other motion can be moved into movement from that. And once there is a particular kind of consequence of some motion that can give us ice solids, such that we get solid containers of internal motion interacting with other solid containers of internal motion, well, then we're off to the races. And so, anyway, from here being repeating tile pattern meshes of linked together vibrating ice solids coated in electrical charge with their various forms, textures, and groupings in pH, i.e., amounts of H or hydrogen ions or protons to give off, all holding each other gravitationally and affecting each other electromagnetically. From here, from this world of chemistry, we start heading towards biology. Because even as we get even more dynamic interplay between these meshes and between their compound objects, such that they solidify and move around, flowing, gluing together in chains, twisting and writhing and gliding through the waters and atmospheres of Earth, some combine into compounded mega shapes, a shape made up of aggregated smaller shapes that ends up being more than the sum of its parts. These compounds of compounds are essentially lots of meshes held together and integrated by the combined forces within and without in a way that recreates the same pattern that gave us planets, etc., in the cosmos and their hydrostatic equilibrium. So once again, in this super compound of various meshes of repeating tile patterns coming together, like goes with like, and all the solids together at their core, then all the liquids around that, and then the gases, and finally at the outermost perimeter of this mega shape, the electrical force of the combined black body radiation emitting from all the quarks that make up the whole thing, all resulting in a dense solid core nucleus at the center, surrounded by a sea of activity, and far beyond this, a perimeter where the combined electromagnetic force of the compounded compound meets the combined electromagnetic force of the surrounding environment, and results, as usual, in a recreation of a Higgs-like context on this scale, a much colder, emptier slice of space-time, such that whatever exists between the electrical perimeter limit of the compounded compound becomes crystallized into mass, into solidity, or at least lipidity. And these are what we call cells, massive cities of combined compounds shaped by forces into a dense and vibrating nucleus at the center, and an electrical and solid cell wall at the perimeter, and a sea of intracellular fluid between. They are stable by default, save for maybe a collision with another configuration that might blow them apart, or some electrochemical disintegration of their cell walls. And now that we have these cells, the most relevant way we can consider them amidst our whole ocean of gravitational activity we might call a universe, at least in this particular location where these shapes have accumulated, the most relevant way we might consider them isn't so much by the physical dimensions of them as objects, but rather by their impact on the surrounding environment. Because while all those yet ongoing processes that give rise to their components and their compounding into cellular formations are very important, these configurations of objects we call cells do so many things that are or seem to be way beyond what we've seen so far in this ocean of gravity. Or maybe it's just that we're biased. In any case, when we zoom out of the inner structure of the cell components to take in the cell as a whole and the surrounding environment, we see a core surrounded by a very individualized intracellular fluid space and then enclosed by an electrically charged membrane. And all the subsequent magic of life and biology that we're going to see after this level is because of this tripartite structure. Because whatever nuclear or electric forces are expelled by the balled up meshes and strings of the core nucleus writhing against itself on account of the intrinsic and ever present standing waves of vibrating quarks within them, those expelled forces from the nucleus will interact with the electrically charged cell wall at the perimeter and with the overall soup of the intracellular fluid that is enclosed between the nucleus and the cell wall. It is the uniqueness of this continuously cooked soup, trapped between the charged cell wall and the pulsating nucleus, and froth it into all manner of consequences. It is this that gives rise to all the consequential characteristics of cells, the electromagnetic forces they take in or put out, the way photons affect them, and thus the visual phenomenon of them, the proportion of hydrogen ions or protons that they express out through their cell walls, or the amount of mass that they have, i.e., the solid ice gathered around their nucleus or littered throughout the intracellular fluid or woven through their cell walls. So, like we said, when one zooms out to regard a cell, we observe another iteration of a gravitationally organized, solid shelled, electromagnetically radiating object with motion within. Another iteration of planets and stars. And more importantly, we begin to see all sorts of behaviors happening as a result of the outwardly propelled forces that are the sum total of all that's happening inside, clashing against the forces or motion of all the sum total of what's happening outside in the surrounding environment. And so, just like before, we have a background ocean in which motions, forces, and objects are interacting. But unlike the beginning with the standing waves, where our background ocean was otherwise moving and unmoving gravity, or later with the spherical bodies of planets and stars, where our background ocean was the electromagnetic force field and radiating light, now our background ocean is everything outside the compounds of compounds that are cells, and everything outside the compounds of compounds of compounds that are multicellular organisms, as we will go on to see. This background ocean now, at this level of complexity that we're talking about, is composed of radiated light in various wavelengths, electrical charges, and entire atomic elemental meshes, ions, hydrogens, oxygens, carbons, etc., just floating about. And in this background ocean of gases, liquids, solids, light, and electrical charge, our cells form and drift and collide and give out and take in protons and neutrons and electrical charge, expressing their intrinsic motion as electromagnetic forces of attraction and repulsion and transformation, and indeed a sticky combination with other cells. When we come to full humans and we start talking about things like respiration and digestion, we are still really just describing an unmasked version of these behaviors of cells taking in particles from the surrounding environment and expressing particles back out into it. All right, let's talk self replication, the real bedrock of biological phenomena. Because, of course, respiration and the like are very cool and very important. But once we have forms that express their intrinsic motion out into the surrounding background ocean of stuff, not merely as electromagnetic forces of attraction and repulsion and combination, but also as self replication, well, then we've got the markings of a new paradigm to observe in our world. And to get to self replication, it only needs to be true that the provocation of more particle formation in the ocean of gravity by the motion of a given self contained entity happens in such a way that these new particles are motioned into existence within the boundaries of said self contained entity. In other words, if the motion of an object stirs more particles into motion, into being within the ocean of gravity, and those new particles are all contained within the boundaries of that same object, then that object is growing. And all these newly formed quark bubbles or baryon marbles, etc., these little bits or building blocks, they will be subject to the same environmental constraints, the same totality of consequences of the surrounding electromagnetical forces coming from the other self contained entities and the ever moving ocean of stuff between, that the first object was, they will be subject to the same totality of consequences of surrounding electromagnetic forces coming from all the other self contained entities and the ever moving ocean of stuff between. The same constraints that make this same particular self contained entity we're talking about here, the way that it is, the shape and the color and the frequency that it is, these new bits will be subjected to that. So all these new building blocks will be rearranged by these forces into another copy of the original self-contained entity. And luckily for us avid observers of human evolution, this whole electromagnetic symphony of self-recreation within self, it works out as separate but entangled duplicate copies of the original singular self-contained entity rather than just an infinite loop of descending Russian nesting dolls. And this is because of that same thing that gave us spherical bodies floating in space time instead of just vast planes of meshes. That tendency of like to group with like, or equivalent at least, and to compound, such that the ice solids that make up the physical substrate of planets and stars clump together as a core and are encased by an outer shell of their electric field. Here, the new bits of atomic elemental meshes generated within the self contained entity on account of its intrinsic motion in the ocean of gravity and the consequences thereof, they get sorted on this like with like basis into the densest solid bits together at the core nucleus and the less dense electrical charge carrying bits joining the original cloud of less dense electrical charge carrying bits at the perimeter membrane of the self contained entity, etc. Such that initially this self replication is actually just multiplied expansion of the one self contained entity. More core, more membrane, growing until just before doubling in size, it splits. The double volume nucleus and the double length membrane too much to hold together gravitationally, not when there's so much electromagnetic force around to pull it apart into two separate instances of that shape of self contained entity. In other words, the space time available, the shape of motion it is possible to be in this neighborhood of the ocean of gravity after all the surrounding activity is consolidated into a counter electromagnetic charge, that shape is the original shape that the self contained entity we started with already was. That's why it was as it was when we first met it, before we had to start figuring out how to contain its own growth within its own perimeter. That shape that it was before all this internal entropy began is the shape that is allowed when one works out the math between its own intrinsic motion and that of all else that is surrounding. So now, just because it's being pushed internally to double in size and shape and waveform of motion, this doesn't necessarily change the facts of the limits of the surrounding environment. So its expansion, rather than continuing indefinitely, gets collapsed by the surrounding total electromagnetic context into two instances of the waveform that there is space for. Voila. Now, well, technically, as of approximately 2.5 billion years ago, we have in hand the fundamentals of biology. We have cells, self contained entities that are meshes of various atomic elemental configurations layered on themselves into compounds and gravitationally organized with the densest solid parts gathered tightly in the center, at the center as a nucleus, and the less dense bits floating around in layers of gradually decreasing density until a membrane that is formed of its most electrically charged and reactive parts, repulsing all else in the surrounding environment away from it, resulting in a Higgs-esque solid cell wall, which makes the self-contained entity thusly described. And we have self-replication. Biology then is the consequence, the total internal and external consequences of the motion of self replicating cells. That whole cycle of intrinsic waveform motion resulting in more bits, resulting in a doubling of the core and the membrane, etc., until it all collapses into duplicate copies. And then on top of that, of course, we are also concerned with how the electrically charged membranes of these duplicates, and indeed everything else around, will react to one another. That's biology. When we have large swarms of these self replicating cells doing merely this replication trick and floating together in clumps amidst this ocean of stuff that is our world, we call them single celled organisms, like bacteria, like all the colonies that live on your body. However, where these clumps of self replicating cells reach sizes and internal qualities of a nature where the electromagnetic context acting on one end of the collection of cells is different from that acting on the other ends, we get, with some of these collections, the phenomenon of multicellularity. This is where the bound together collections of cells still holds together. They still recognize the sameness of each other's waveforms in contrast to the distinction of the surrounding electromagnetic context out there, still recognize that enough to cohere together, notwithstanding their differences in the qualities of their various parts of their collective, in terms of color or texture or frequential emission, all on account of being acted on by different surrounding electromagnetic contexts. When this is the case, we have the building blocks of a multicellular organism, and we finally begin to approach the era and layer of human beings in action. Because multicellular organisms are essentially where the compounded waveforms of all these cell wall enclosed collections of atomic nuclei unite into one overall waveform, a harmonic combination of all wavelengths into a single waveform that thusly acts on the surrounding environment in one single unified fashion. Again, we see that rule or pattern or tendency of our universe once more, that where resonant waveforms combine, they will reach a threshold, a certain threshold wherein their combination is compelled into a structure where like gathers with like, and all the dense bits cohere toward a center, and the less dense bits, the more charged bits coalesce around the edges. And eventually, even though many interesting things are happening to result in individual cell formation, and even though interesting things are happening to result in cells self replicating, and agglomerating into bound collectives, what is most interesting to observe now is how these organic collections of multiple cells are exchanging charge and mass between each other, and how they are expressing the harmonized totality of their charges and masses out beyond their combined perimeters of cell walls, beyond their skin. Another way of saying this is that we're concerned with how their movement of their nuclei, on account of vibrating quarks deep within, will be expressed as acids into the intracellular fluid, nucleic acid being the Na in DNA or RNA, etc., and then how these acids will be compounded and cooled into lipids and proteins in the intracellular fluid, and then expressed out of the cell wall to affect the other cells and the intraorganism fluid that they all float in. And then finally, how that intraorganism fluid will go on to affect the surrounding environment outside the skin membrane of the overall cellular collective. So, to recap, we start with concerning ourselves with how these cells clump together and break apart and interact with other cells. And perhaps most importantly, how they absorb energy or forces from their surrounding environment and combine it with the acid pressed out of their own writhing nuclei to form more bits that ultimately compound into copies of the cell. But then after that, we start seeing that some of these cells, those that can do this replication trick as a result of the chemistry happening inside their biological structure, we see that they start clumping together into systems of shapes and action sequences in between these shapes, such that we now have large bodies of cells clumped together in cellular collectives into tissues, kind of like the repeating tile meshes of atomic structure from before. And these are clumped together in such a way that the immediately surrounding environment beyond the cell wall for each cell begins to differ depending on where in the system they are located. Because, like, one part of the collective cellular object is interacting with the surrounding environment in this particular spot, then another part of the cellular collective might be way over, like a few microns away, and experiencing a very different surrounding electromagnetic environment as a result. And so now, because of this, you have different features or differentiation happening amongst the cells in this collective. Because remember, each cell configuration itself, from core nucleus out to the cell wall, is the result of the interactions between the outwardly forced pressure from the nucleus, the electrical charges and vibrating solids of the intracellular fluid, the electrical force and frozen solid limit of the cell wall, and the surrounding environment beyond all of this. And so all the parts are continuously changing. And all the changes affect everything else. And all in all, if the surrounding environment touching one of the cells in the collective is different to that touching the others, then that cell will look and act differently to the others. And so that's how we get different features or differentiation within and among cells that are grouped together in a systemic configuration of tissues or organelles or organs. That's why neurons, cells located in the human brain, have axon heads and dendrite tails that look different from each other and do different things. The contexts that surround one part of this type of cell are different than those that surround another part. And so the shape and charge or behavior they are provoked into expressing are different. And in the same vein, it's why neurons as a whole, and for instance, skin or liver cells, are very different indeed. Even though technically and actually it is the same thing, it's a membrane enclosed configuration of multiple compounded compounds of atomic elemental meshes taking in and expressing out various charges and solids. And eventually, the totality of some of these systems of cellular collectives, these tissues, they compound into organs and then compounds of cellular collectives that move in an electromagnetic synchrony of hydrostatic equilibrium and so express a collectively stable waveform that coheres internally and acts in a unified manner on the surrounding environment. And eventually, the totality of some of these systems of cellular collectives, these tissues, compound into organs, compounds of cellular collectives that move in electromagnetic synchrony in hydrostatic equilibrium and so express a collectively stable waveform that coheres internally and acts externally in a unified manner on the surrounding environment. Organs, whether they be found on their lonesome as non animal creatures or whether they be found amidst a collective organism, they're defined by being an organized system of cellular tissue working in sync to perform the total composite effect of their cellular waveforms on the surrounding environment. Organisms, then, are compounds of organs that take on a so called life of their own, made up of compounds of molecular elements that are cells, further compounding into multicellular tissues, and then organelles and then those tissue meshes compound into organs, which then finally compound into organisms. Giant solar system style configurations of compounded cells collectively exchanging charge and mass with the surrounding environment in a coherent fashion. A system of systems of systems of cells. The relevant unit of study now finally can be the human being, an organic system of meshes of cells, billions and billions of them, in a shape that is still, despite obfuscating complexity, reminiscent of how planets and stars and cells and organs cohere and are internally arranged by gravitational forces of like with like. So, densest writhing core at the heart, diffusest electrochemical forces at the outermost perimeter, and in between, an ocean of intra-organism fluid full of interacting charges and acids and bases, a soup made up of the total output of all the soups expressed from all the individual cells. And these expressed soups from the individual cells are in turn made from the individual nuclei within those cells pulsating and moving through the intracellular fluid enclosed by the cell wall to produce a particular output of acidic or electric charge expressed outwards beyond the cell wall. And so the aggregate of that output from each cell is the blood, is the fluids, is the viscera, is the material and the chemical of the body of the organism. And you'll recall that this nucleonic pulsating that's happening inside all the cells to make this acid is itself because of the writhing of the strings that make up the DNA and RNA within the nucleus, which itself arises on account of the electrochemical charges inside, which are because of the vibrations of their atoms, which is because of the electrical charge of the electron shells, which is because of the collision of ice-shelled baryons, which exist on account of the interplay of forces between standing wave spheres in the ocean of gravity and the rest of the otherwise motion and stillness of that same ocean of gravity. So now we have organisms, membrane encased chemical soups with dense pulsating cores. And while there are theoretically infinite possible variations of these membrane soups, the ones that persist long enough to matter are those ones whose internal reactions are vigorous enough to maintain themselves, but not so vigorous as to destroy themselves. It's a bit like earlier when the shapes of objects that could exist in the electromagnetic field of the cosmos were the ones that represented a stable equation between internal forces and external environment. Here again, the same principle and a fine balance between the internal motion of the membrane soup that is the organism and the external motion of the surrounding environment of the world around it, that's just a particular pattern of chemical reactions. And patterns of chemical reactions expressed on the membrane and outward into the environment, those are the characteristics and behaviors of the organism. When we talk about a person's features or their actions, This is the same thing as talking about signature patterns of chemical reactions and physical collisions between internal and external forces. A behavior is a recursive set of chemical reactions, a bunch of caused effects that go on to cause more effects, which go on to cause more effects, etc., ad infinitum, at least until the organism disintegrates and the pending chemical reactions cannot run their course. Now, obviously, it's hard to actually think about the human and, human characteristics and behaviors as mere chemical reactions because there are just so many taking place simultaneously and at all times. And I think the best place to lay the blame for why there's so much going on within and without the membrane enclosing our multicellular collective is at the foot of our foremost ancestor who first ate something. About 2 or 2.5 billion years ago, one particular lineage of multicellular organisms developed, or I should really say experienced, a behavior that ratcheted up its volume of chemical reactions to mind boggling and uncountable levels. It opened its membrane, not fully, but just enough to let a rush of surrounding environment inwards, a gulp. And that gulp is no small thing because it changes the fundamental nature of the intracellular environment in one sweep. Our universe and our bodies are all a sequence of if this, then that reactions, and eating, ingesting, engulfing, and internalizing. This is a behavior that increases the volume and frequency of if statements, as in the if this, then that cause and effect code that governs our universe and has been playing out throughout time is still going. If a standing wave collides with itself, then a bubble forms. If bubbles combine, then baryons emerge. If baryons cluster, then atoms occur. If atoms compound, then molecules arise. If molecules collide, then chemical reactions happen. If chemistry unfolds inside a membrane, then the biology of those chemical reactions plays out within, without, and on that membrane. And now, with our ether, every swallowed molecule creates a new set of possible reactions. Every reaction produces byproducts that alter future reactions. Each shift in the electrical landscape alters the next membrane behavior, and so on, and so on. Cause and effect being pressed into increasingly elaborate outcomes because the interior of the organism keeps changing even as the already set in motion consequences of previous biochemical reactions continue to be queued up to play out until the record of the if this then that code of the universe in this particular bit of space-time gets more complicated, gets so complicated it's impossible to track or at least spell it out in full. And a perfect example of the leveling up of chemical complexity that you can get from eating as a behavior sits right at the very start of our lineage, our foremost ancestor who ate a whole damn mitochondrial cell, literally engulfs it. We're not talking a few spare hydrogens or a glucose molecule, but an entire structurally complete organism with its own membrane bound chemistry. And then the if this, then that sequence of reactions played out such that instead of this mitochondrial cell being dissolved into the internal soup, it ends up incorporated wholly because the forces that it is spewing out from its own membrane are more than what the external environment, i.e., the internal soup of our ancestor organism, is pressing back against it. So both cells hold each other in tension or static equilibrium, pinging each other in a way that keeps on looping indefinitely. And when this ether cell goes on to self replicate, the mitochondrial cell is included in the copies, and 2-ish billion years later, all human cells are still self replicated with a mitochondrial cell built in. The if this, then that sequence of events caused by eating that day, 2-ish billion years ago, didn't just change the chemical soup of the organism for that moment, it created another whole new source of recursive chemical reactions forever. So, anyway, yes, at this point, the interior of the organism becomes too busy to narrate cleanly as sequences of chemical reactions. It's still all, another thing happens, and another thing happens, and another thing happens, then another thing happens. But now it's like in endless loops, citric acid loops, redox loops, phosphorylation loops, continuously triggered cyclical if this, then that chemical reactions where cell components exchange kinetic energy or tiny packets of electroatomic motion or specific shapes of molecules. like the infamous ATP molecule that mitochondria push out into our cells, aka adenosine triphosphate, aka an adenosine shaped acid and three phosphates or three light bearing or pigment molecules. And I hope you can recognize the fundamental equivalence between a cell component or a cell in a cell expressing an acid plus some light bearing molecules and an atom expressing electrical plus photonic radiation, repeating patterns. So, yeah, these cycles, these sequences of biochemical reactions within organisms create energy for the organism, as we sometimes say, in the sense that the quantum of energy expressed as the upshot of the chemical reaction goes on to trigger another instance of that same chemical reaction, thus, a recursive loop. And so we have cause and effect not merely happening, but being pressed into increasingly elaborate outcomes and perpetually recurring loops that trigger themselves to happen over and over again until the organism disintegrates. And all because the interior soup of the organism keeps changing, keeps adding new and ever more elaborate cause and effect sequences, even as the already set in motion consequences of previous reactions continue to be queued up to play out. And thus, even though under the hood, everything is still the same chemistry, is still the same electrically charged collisions between ice shelled baryonic marbles and quark bubbles, the same standing waves vibrating inside the ocean of gravity, and all that jazz, the expression of it, when seen in the scale and complexity of biological life, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes the characteristics and the behavior of organisms, complex patterns of electrochemical expression onto the membrane and out into the surrounding environment as the internal motion of the organism is balanced out against the external forces of the surroundings. The vibrating electrical gradients as energy balanced within is balanced against energy without becomes skin color and textures and movements. The ingestion of the external world becomes eating and digestion, and the whole thing becomes recognizable to us as life, though strictly speaking, it is the same cascade of consequences as before, simply happening inside and around a membrane whose contents won't stop rearranging themselves and complexifying. By the time we reach our earliest eukaryotic ancestor, around 2 billion years ago, the eater, we have an organism beyond the complexity that we started off with when we're talking about organisms, beyond merely a harmoniously synchronized system of organs, of tissues playing out if this, then that chemical reactions within and without its collective membrane. Now we have radical and logarithmic scale exchanges between internal chemical soups and external universe of forces, because our guy is inhaling gases and absorbing ions and drinking liquids and engulfing solids and osmotically pulling through whatever energy gradients crosses its membrane. And each exchange spikes the internal churn of chemical reactions, on top of the infinite list of already playing out ones queued up from before, sending another branching, escalating wave through that same if this, then that logic that began with ripples in gravity and now has become the logic of biological behavior and life. And somewhere in the middle of all this pulsing, self rearranging cellular choreography, 2-ish billion years ago, another emergent pattern makes itself known: the tendency of these membrane soups to store records of previous shapes resulting from chemical reactions, to lay down trails of chemical breadcrumbs inside themselves, notches on their nucleic strings, such that the next iteration of a given if this acid situation will tend to retrigger the same then that protein again. We call these breadcrumb trails, these notches on nucleic strings, genes. Long spiraled strings of acid whose twists and folds encode the shapes they were previously pulled into. They are remembered solutions to previously experienced chemical reactions. They are remembered solutions to the recurring problems of being alive or being an integrated system of organs functioning in a given environment. And because the environment itself is never still, these trails are not fixed monuments, but they are modifiable scripts. The surrounding forces, the nutrients, the stress, the heat, the motion, the light, each of which can pull a section of the acid string into a particular shape and recreate the acid protein it expressed before. They can also tag the strings with little chemical bookmarks of repeated use, These are like amplifiers of that string's attractive force to the returning electrochemical context, should it assemble within the organism again. And this is what the biologists call upregulation. And conversely, disuse or antagonistic conditions can reduce a string's tendency to release acid in that same pattern it did before. And that's downregulation. And this is epigenetics, the environment dipping its fingers into the organism's record of previous activity and adjusting the volume on different tendential that responses to recurring if triggers. And as these organisms replicate and spread across landscapes of wildly different pressures and opportunities, the grand if this then that logic of the universe asserts itself on another scale. Certain habits of chemical reaction and protein formation persist because the genetic record that makes them likely to happen again remains physically intact and often covered in amplifiers from prior use. Other sequences of chemical reactions vanish because their records are destroyed or become inaccessible after persistent downregulation. And all these habits of chemical reaction are what everything is about in the end. Because for organisms as elaborate as us, our visible material is just composites of protein expression. We keep being issued into being as the composite protein structure we are from moment to moment by the sum total of chemical reactions taking place within and around us, mediated by our genetic record of what has happened before. And within the human experience, it is the same thing. It's all proteins, really. Every sight you see, every mood you feel, every twitch of muscle or thought or memory is ultimately just a particular arrangement of proteins and acids being expressed or suppressed or folded or unfolded or activated or deactivated or tagged or cleaved or just moved around inside and between cells. Your immune system is a choreography of proteins doing stuff. Your emotions are cascades of acids and protein receptors engaging. Your learning is the strengthening or weakening of protein pathways carved and etched across the neural membranes of your body. So now there's so much else happening, of course. The vast colonies of microbiome that live inside you and are eating sugar all the time are responsible for many of the chemical reactions that are integral to a human being persisting and growing. And below the level of acids and proteins, the electromagnetic configuration of the human is critical for the emergent phenomenon of consciousness. But for the most part, besides that, it is just acids and proteins doing things. So while genes and epigenetic tags sketch the tendencies of what might get generated or expressed, it is the proteins themselves that are the doing of human life and experience and expression. So, yes, that is what Darwin and Wallace were going on about with natural selection. How environmental pressures not only provoke protein formation in the first place by giving the internal acid soup something to chemically react against to form them, but then the environment also comes back around to encourage or discourage the repetition of certain reactions and certain proteins by up or down regulating the genetic record of past protein formation. And so now this is the level, I guess, 16 degrees of compounding complexity later from our zeroth layer of gravity's unmoved ocean. This is where it begins to look like what we know well enough, materially speaking. How outward expressions of internal biochemical states interact with each other. Animal characteristics and behavior, zoology, the humanities, all tracking the continued consequences of electrochemical expression through the characteristics and behavior of the organism. And that brings us to our final stop in this whole saga, because there is one particularly key loop of biochemical processes and behavior to highlight in this whole story. And that is the loop that allows the universe to keep remaking these elaborate architectures of chemical consequences we call human beings. That's reproduction. In essence, the formation of a new organism is simply what happens whenever there is enough nucleic acid that finds itself gathered into a sufficiently sheltered pocket of spacetime. A new self replicating cell will emerge whenever there's enough chemical density within the confines of a membrane. And once we have a self replicating cell, that same old if this, then that logic will play out again. multicellular meshes differentiating and compounding into tissues and into organs, acids being expressed as the consequence of atomic nucleic motion reacting with the intracellular environment, those acids folding into proteins, and the nucleic strings of each cell bearing a record of what proteins have happened before, such that they tend to happen again. What we call a womb is merely one such sufficiently sheltered pocket of space-time for this whole thing to unfold and play out. It's a temporarily prepared chamber whose temperature and nutrients and electromagnetic gradients and chemical boundaries resemble, in miniature, the primordial settings in which these first cells once came together. A chamber made so as a result of the acids and proteins provoked in the body of the mother by the emissions of the newly assembled self-replicating cell. A chicken's egg is another such chamber of sufficiently protected space-time. A puddle on an ancient shoreline was once another. Underwater vents, the contexts differ, but the underlying physical choreography does not. So when two humans exchange the molecular signatures of their histories, half libraries of notched nucleic strings, and then these are concentrated together inside such a chamber, the combined if this then that script begins playing itself forward again. Inside the newly formed zygote, the whole choreography restarts, all the familiar spirals we've talked about reasserting themselves. The embryo unfolds because matter, compounds, and energy behave exactly as they always do. They propagate, they differentiate, they stabilize, they destabilize, they find new equilibria after that. All that. Tissues form because cells made of proteins cluster, organs form because tissues cluster based on their different chemical inclination. Limbs form because waves of acid expression from genes on nucleic strings sweep across membranes in timed pulses, like the ripples in the same ocean of gravity we began with. Fetal development is a self-organizing avalanche of protein expression inside a protected electromagnetic chamber, guided only by the constraints of inherited chemical memory and the laws of physics. By the end of those 40 weeks, what emerges is simply what had to emerge when that particular combination of if this starting causes was able to play out the usual then that effects. A human being humming with the entire layered history of the universe inside every cell. There are, of course, other complex behaviors of the human animal we could materially break down at this stage. But that is enough for today, and this has gone on long enough. I have summarized the material truth enough for you to appreciate, hopefully, how we get from nothingness to matter to behavior, such that we could eventually, if we kept going, we could trace up through the aggregate consequences of all that behavior through history, through contemporary pop culture, and to me, here, right now, trying to explain to you the fundamentals of the material as it relates to human beings. Hopefully, though this journey has been long, and I've obviously glossed some parts, it has given you the capacity to come back full circle, to regard human characteristics and behavior as the consequence of the aggregate of bodily forces colliding with the environment, where those bodily forces themselves are the result of the roiling soup within the enclosure seat of the skin, where the total motion and interactive electrical charge between cells is colliding dramatically at all times, in part because the organism keeps adding more chemistry from the surrounding environment through various orifices, and in part because the cells themselves are energized by the internal motion of their nuclei, which are electrified into writhing masses by their exchange of charged particles, hydrogen ions, electrons, whatever is moving across the mesh, which itself is happening because atoms collide with each other. As a result of the subatomic motion within each atomic core, because both the quarks at the center, bubbling gluonically, and the electron shell membrane around them are just shapes of motion, of current, of waves in whatever the fuck that is the nothing everythingness of the field of gravity. Have a nice day. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope the gargantuan amount of effort it took to make this has paid off. and you are glad you clicked on this video? If so, please do like and subscribe and share the link with someone. Every little helps grow this space into its full potential. Thank you. Goodbye.